1965, I got a job at a small college in Pennsylvania, Franklin and Marshall College. Benjamin Franklin and John Marshall were the founders. Pretty good place. Small classes, lovely way to start teaching. And this was a period of the Vietnam War and campus unrest, quote unquote, and bad reactions from campus administrators, including Franklin and Marshall College. So I and two others in the Anthro department there decided we'd find other jobs if we could, and would read the Anthropology newsletter that was put out by the American Anthropology Association. And I saw an ad for McMaster University looking for an anthropologist with a specialty in anything except the North. And I thought, oh, shoot. Because I knew a couple of the people from there from hearing conference papers. Dave Damas, who was a major Arctic figure, nicknamed the Arctic Char because he once burned down an igloo. It took a Coleman lantern and his going off somewhere and forgetting. And Dick Slobodin, who was a real gentleman, scholar, influence on me. So I thought, oh, I'd love to go to that department. And the next month's newsletter still had the ad, and the third one was enough so that I count 3 as the important ritual number. So I wrote a little letter saying this might come as a complete embarrassment to think about another Northernist, but if you don't find who you're looking for, excuse me, I'd be interested. And I got a nice letter back from Dick Slobodin, who was the acting chair, saying, quote, actually, we're not all that averse to another Northernist. Send your CV. I did. The upshot was that I got the job. And much larger classes in the hundreds. Terrifying at first. And 25 years at Mac. Privileged career academically, privileged career anthropologically. I got up to, I think it was 378 or something like that in the first year lectures. Became adroit with an overhead projector and had to organize my lectures a good deal more than small classes where you had free-flowing discussion. But I had those too. They came in the senior and graduate levels. I had some very good graduate students. Learned a lot from them. I still do. One of the first PhD students I had never finished his dissertation, wound up working for the Crees. He's now 2 years from retirement. And he is responsible for the Cree embassy in Ottawa. And fluent in Cree. He was my replacement at Waskaganish. And he not only stayed, but he made it a point to learn Cree. To the point where a fellow from Wiminji told me that he'd been out at a meeting somewhere and he'd heard this fellow talking in Cree and he couldn't figure out who it was. Usually by the tone of voice he could tell who it was, and he went around the corner to see who it was, and it was a white man. Well, it was Brian Craik. And Brian is still working with the Crees. With the Crees. I'm still working with Crees. Working with is the operative term here, I think. And because it's a collaboration. And we have a good deal of interest right now in the Truth and Reconciliation report and how this will be implemented. And working with people is the answer there, too. Okay. So I came to Mac and was very pleased with that and weathered the big lectures and met some very interesting people as graduate students, a few of whom went to James Bay, like Brian, after Brian, and wrote interesting material. And it was very gratifying to feel like the James Bay research was still alive and well, because anthropology field research has changed quite a lot over the time that I was there and since. So that going back to the same place, spending long periods of time with any one setting is something of a rarity now. People usually sample several groups and write on some topic that each of these groups can inform us about, but not what we call somewhat snobbishly depth ethnography. I think many of the people that you'll record are depth ethnographers. Excuse. And so it's a rich experience. When I retired, by that time, some of my colleagues had retired, and they stopped. When I retired, I thought, why throw all of this away? I've been packing it in all these years. So I didn't. Anthropology lets me go on doing what I want to do. That's the other beauty of anthropology. You get a job, you're fairly secure. You can do pretty much what you want to do as long as you carry your load within the department, within the university. And one of the things that comes up now and again is methodology. As far as I know, I have no methodology. My method is to think about it a lot. Regna Darnell convened a conference sometime in the 80s, I think, on the Boasian tradition in anthropology, and she got some of the gray eminences to come, including Ward Goodenough, who had been the editor of AA when I got my master's thesis published, and Dill Himes, who had recommended that it not be published, but who changed his mind later. At any rate, when I said that my method was to think about it a lot, it got a rather good-humored agreement from these other guys who are regarded as paragons of methodology and method and so on. It doesn't mean that they have no method and that methods don't vary. As Radin told us in 1933, a method is a varying process depending on the nature of the data studied and the interest of the person doing the study. Yeah, well, my interest was in understanding stories. And I developed some ability at that, and I could go on doing it. I also was asked to be part of projects. Now, it was around 1965, I'm jerking around a bit here, that we asked Gertie Diamond to come and live with us in Lancaster, PA, where I was teaching, to transcribe my tapes. She was the first high school graduate from Waskaganish. She had babysat for us in Waskaganish and very quickly became like an older sister to my kids. That lasted for 50 years until she died. And I and two of my daughters and my wife, Betty, We've only been married 25 years now. So, all went to the funeral, and I spoke about that. But it was an enduring friendship. Yeah, I loved Gertie. She regarded herself as a part of my family and said so, and we exchanged news about our kids, good and bad news, kids sort of in between, good and bad times, and visits. Well, Gertie married a fellow teacher named John Murdoch, and John and I then became friends, which lasted until her death, which I attribute partly to John. She died from a stroke. After all those years, from 1971 to 2015, said that he was serving her with divorce papers and that he was going to represent himself at court in opposition to her. She was terribly humiliated and embarrassed and wrote to me about it. And it wasn't long after that she had the stroke. John is somewhat paranoid. A paranoid to a non-specialist means somebody who is practical and will not take no for an answer and thinks that people are against him with good reason. Okay, well, that's John. Afraid of everything. Gertie once told him, John, just pick one thing that you're afraid of and work on it. And John said, Gertie, I'm afraid of everything. So yeah, there's a reason to understand John, I guess, but he and I are no longer friends. Very few people in this world that I've written off, and he's one. At any rate, Gert spent the winter and then a second winter living with us, tried unsuccessfully to teach me Cree, beat me at cribbage regularly, and transcribed all my tapes, doing a little correction of translation now and again. And John had the idea, very, very good idea, that school, he was a teacher there, was not working very well, that bus drivers and streetcars and so on didn't resonate very well with little kids who came from a remote Cree village and had never seen a bus driver or a bus or a streetcar or whatever. And so he had the idea to develop curriculum on the spot using a Gestetner duplicator, stapler, and so on. And so I became a kind of a collaborator because he wanted to use some of John's stories for curriculum material. And then as it began to catch on, I applied to the Donner Foundation and got a grant, a 3-year grant, which astonished and terrified John even more because now he had to use the money responsibly and enlarge his project. But he did, and he brought people in from other communities there who, as a part of a workshop, did a little curriculum development of their own, then went back and did more. Cree School Board adopted it. And it continued on with one of Gertie's older sisters working at it, and a niece, for years after John had gone off to Saskatchewan for an MA and then Manitoba for a PhD. I was his external on the PhD, and Skip Coolidge, who you may meet, sent him to McMaster with a request that I chain John to a desk and fill him up with theory. And I told John that was my mandate, and he said, well, that means I'll have to buy 2 plane tickets because I'm going around the north proselytizing Cree, and I just have to buy another ticket for the desk. And so John was on the move a good deal, successfully. He got his papers in earlier than the deadline. When the term was over, he was out of there. Did well in his courses. and left a kind of a Lone Ranger effect on the other grad students. You know, who was that masked man? Because nobody got to know him very well. But he was an important part of that, and although he was very difficult, Gertie put up with him for a long time and hadn't written him off after he had written her off. Okay, well, so Gertie was very important in this process, too. And so where do we go from here? Okay, I recruited myself to McMaster, and it worked. Teaching, I very much prefer conversation, which means small groups, and people who, because of the immediate eye contact, can't turn off and think about something else, or now read their screens and so on. Although I've got a lousy voice today because of a sore throat, I have a fairly resonant voice. And I found that with the big lectures, I could just pick up the mic and say, all right, and everybody would quiet down. And then I could not stop talking until the end of 50 minutes, because if I stopped talking, the noise would begin to build, and I'd lost them. So it's a performance art. I'm not a performer. I told my department after my first year of the big lectures that they really should have hired Bill Cosby, because, sorry, Bill, you got into trouble later, but at the time he was a very funny man that people really listened to, and he could get a few points across very well. I wasn't sure I could get across points at all well. I'll give you an example. I was teaching a big class, basic anthropology, and I did my anthropology of religion lecture one day, and this fellow came up and he said, I've got a question. He says, I'm Islamic myself. And I thought, oh, shit, I'm in trouble. And I sit back there with some of my friends. We're all Islamic. And we're wondering why you don't talk about Islam. I said, well, I don't really know much about Islam, and I don't want to say something that's wrong. He said, well, that's too bad, because everything you say fits. And I thought, oh, my God. I didn't know who I was talking to. It worked. Who else is out there? From where else? And does it fit or not? No idea. So one of the problems with huge lecture courses, you don't know who you're talking to. And what you say may fit or may not. And that matters. So I had another Islamic student a few years later who came up after class, and she said, I think that Salman Rushdie should be killed. And I thought, oh boy, not only am I the prof in this course, and anthropology is supposed to be tolerant, but I'm a Quaker, and I'm not too keen on killing. The Quakerism, incidentally, came after the Korean War, quite a lot after, when I came to McMaster. Anyway, what am I going to say? So I said, well, let me think about this and get back to you. And I went to the bookstore and I bought A Short History of Islam. And I read it. Very impressive, actually. And in the last chapter, who should appear but Salman Rushdie? And the fact that there had been a meeting of Ayatollahs in response to Khomeini's fatwa, declaring that that fatwa was not Islamic. It was not legitimate. So I photocopied that page and I gave it to the student. And then the next week she came up and she said, well, I read that. She said, I think you should be punished anyway. But she backed off from the killing, which was some success. So a little harder to reach her than those first guys. Anyway, big classes are a fact of the business of universities. I believe in universities. I think the better educated the public is, the better off we are. And if it means that we have to be more factory-like, well, that's too bad. We should have some occasions for people to think on their feet and exchange ideas directly and so on. So I prepared for my small classes what I call think sheets. Ideas that I had about the topic that we were going to talk about during that seminar. And some of them got a bit long, but they were good for me and they were good for the people taking the seminar. They were things that people could respond to, question, disagree with, whatever. And I also, for 25 years, taught method and theory of field research. So I was supposed to be something of an expert on theory. I read a fair amount of theory, and I realized that the half-life of a theory is about 5 years. And that theorists tend to come up with brilliant, short-lived solutions. So theory, to me, became a toolkit of methods. I still avoid the word methodology because I don't know what it means. And if this method seemed to fit the situation, you used it. And if it didn't, you didn't. And if you were theoretically literate, you had enough tools to help you out in a number of situations. And I still believe that. And so that's the approach I took. And with students, most of the graduate students that I supervised became pretty good friends. There were some bright people. Some did MA theses that wound up being, well, we had one, Lisa Sherman, who had been put into a residential school while her family was in India, who did her thesis on residential schools in James Bay. Very good thesis. And would have been helpful, I think, to the T&R committee if they had had a bit of her perspectives there. But her findings, which I agree with and which Gertie substantiated, is that people that go through residential schools, and this was the first academic paper I gave, peer group versus trapline. Residential schools, you grow up as part of a peer group. Traplines, you grow up as part of a family. You get a different set of skills. You can work as part of a peer group, as the first 12 high school graduates at Waskaganish did, politically and administratively, and very, very well. They had problems with kids. They had problems in their marriages. So they hadn't learned the family skills. Gertie, her oldest son, the one that she did not adopt, is a very successful lawyer. She was very proud of him. He was more or less managing her funeral. She adopted 4 Cree kids, 2 at a time, from Saskatchewan, and she gave them a great deal of attention, support, attempted to give them a model for being a parent, and watched them all having big problems with their marriages and their kids. And so residential schools had something positive to offer. Being adroit as an administrator, as a politician. After all, kids growing up as a peer group learn to operate in a way that gets past the institutional restraints, right? You learn that everything is negotiable. Billy Diamond learned that everything is negotiable. He negotiated, with the support of these other guys, the James Bay Agreement. And say what you will, good, bad, or indifferent, it was a success. It gave them a parliamentary authority with which to negotiate further. And that continues. It's something that made a difference in the world. Okay? So residential school made a difference in the world. It also made for pretty rocky personal life. So you get this at a cost, at a personal cost. And I remember Billy from when he was a high school student, bringing a non-native kid home for a visit in the summer and walking around town shooting off firecrackers and generally making a bit of a political spectacle of himself. I remember him getting recruited as the first band manager there, and the old woman saying, if he does that, he's going to get some girl pregnant and he's not going to go on to school anymore. He wanted to be a lawyer. Sure enough, he and Liz wound up getting married. He hired a very good lawyer. When the time came, he knew that's what he needed. And of course, he was chief and then grand chief at a very young age. But, difficult times. One quickie on that. Politics is the same, or worse, in native circles. And after the James Bay Agreement was signed, immediately after, Billy said, okay, I'm going to announce it. And the Indians, the Quebec Association chief said, no, we're going to announce it. And the federal negotiator said, no, we're going to announce it. And Billy announced it. And then a lot of his allies were no longer allies, including environmentalists. Billy had a hard time with that. And I remember Gertie and John were staying with us in Hamilton and got a telephone call from Billy. Never got telephone calls from Billy. And how you doing, Dick? It's Billy. Oh, how you doing, Billy? Not very well. I can't stop shaking. Oh, where are you? So he gave me the name of a hotel in Niagara Falls. He and Liz had gone there after he had been vilified by his former friends. And he was having a problem with booze. So I drove to Niagara Falls and brought them back. And the next morning, Billy and Liz and John and Gertie were sitting around the table playing cards and feeling better. Billy went off to the hospital at what was then Fort George, now Chisasibi, to dry out. He called it the Corporation Blues. And it's an apt term. And of course, he had quite a career after that. And a book. And the book originally was ghostwritten with Billy, a collaboration. And Billy showed it to his brother Albert, younger brother Albert, who read it and said, Billy, you didn't do this all by yourself, So Billy had to go back through and rewrite and ring in everybody else. I even have a footnote in there somewhere. And well, that's an example of the ups and downs of residential school. Without residential school, for those guys, they would not have gotten an agreement. They would have been steamrollered by the province of Quebec, Hydro-Quebec, René Lévesque, those guys. And so that's a run on residential school. It caused Gertie to have some deficits and a great deal of strength, from which I benefited as a person and professionally because of the work she did there. And she spent her entire adult career as a community education administrator at Waskaganish. She was a supporter of as many kids as possible getting as much education as possible. When we went to her funeral, we were driving in two cars, her son and his wife in one, and I and Betty and my kids in the other one. All the kids in the school were lined up on both sides of the street waving at us as we came in. Talk about a warm welcome. And of course it was mainly for John Paul, her son, but acknowledging us as well. Kind of impressive. She was her career was a great success.